Audio check. Teams audio check. Morning, everybody. It's 9:30. The inquiry is now resumed. Mr. Hon, do you want to... you're not ready at this stage, are you?
Yes, sir. Apologies. I did email the closing, albeit 15 minutes ago, but it hasn't had time to print yet, for which my apologies. Might it be possible to have 10 minutes just so that we can sort out a printed copy? For
Fine,
which I'm very grateful indeed.
No problem. Okay, let's adjourn the inquiry until 22, then we'll come back and hopefully we can crack on.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. You want to do your CPO? Yeah.
Only one, I guess. I've not actually seen the email, but I gather that Mr. Lane, who is one of the objectors to the CPO, there was some doubt, but he does want to be represented at the inquiry. I don't know, obviously, to what extent and how long that may take. He is represented in the main by Ms. Sutherland, but she has got a clash with another inquiry, and I gather that a colleague of hers will be representing Mr. Lane at the CPO inquiry.
And thank you. And I assume that is to be on Tuesday.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think that affects the likely timing that we were talking about yesterday.
No.
So,
I don't think it does at all. I don't know. I haven't seen this email. I don't know whether there is any written evidence that is going to be produced. If there was, it would be, really helpful to see it in advance. There have been many deadlines, but perhaps we can inquire.
I think we can inquire, obviously, of sorry, I've forgotten his name, but of the gentleman. Yeah, I'll ask the program officer to go back to him and say, yeah, absolutely fine.
Really helpful. I mean, beyond that, obviously, it's entirely a matter of Mr. Lane. And,
indeed, yeah.
That's fine.
Yeah. The only other matter that is, I've said this so many times, the only other matter that's still outstanding is that I gather that the department is still considering whether or not to delegate the CPO to inspectors. We have said, amongst a number of other comments, we have said that it would be really helpful to know by Tuesday morning when we start. They've said that pressure of parliamentary time, getting hold of ministers, etc., it may not be then. I mean, reading slightly between the lines, I get the impression from emails that they may now be intending to delegate the CPO. Obviously, if we hear more before the CPO inquiry starts, we'll let people know. But
I'm really grateful, sir. Obviously, you're for obvious reasons much more in that loop than we are. But we will comply with whatever you.
I guess I ought to say that even if that decision is delegated to us, that won't affect the sort of sequential approach that we were intending to take with the Section 78 and
yes.
cost and then the CPO.
I mean, it seems to me that that's right, because the compelling case in the public interest for compulsory acquiring land is in effect the airport expansion project that just, logically you need to sort of make some decision or if it had been recovered recommendation on one in order to then consider the other. So I don't think it makes a fundamental difference to the logic, although it may to the form in which you do things. Is I think my view.
Yeah, and obviously we'll keep you posted if there is any update on that. Okay.
So we've both tried to kind of string this out long enough for the printing. I mean, I can try and raise another point if you want, but I haven't got anything immediately to mind. No, I think we'll have to adjourn for a few minutes.
Yeah.
We'll just wait for the printed copies and then we'll.
Yeah. Absolutely fine.
Okay, the inquiry is now resumed. We have paper copies. Mr. Hon, are you ready? Do you want a bit more time or no? I'll hand over to you then in that case.
So thank you very much indeed, and thank you again for allowing me to provide you with paper copies. I'm very grateful. For every ton of carbon dioxide emitted into the atmosphere by the expansion of Bristol Airport, a ton of carbon dioxide cannot be emitted elsewhere. That is the simple reality of the obligation on the Secretary of State to achieve the outcomes in the 6th carbon budget, of the obligation to achieve net zero by 2050, and ultimately to avoid contributing further to irreversible climate breakdown. The appellant seeks to downplay this reality by emphasizing that the development proposal represents only a small fraction of greenhouse gas emissions in the aviation sector, a smaller fraction nationally, or an even smaller fraction globally. But if every emitter were allowed to rely on this argument, the cumulative impact of those emissions on the UK's ability to meet its climate change obligations would be wholly erased from planning decision-making. This is plainly contrary to the approach required by the development plan and by national policy. Every ton of carbon emitted into the atmosphere matters. A percentage of the carbon stays active for hundreds of years and accumulates with previous emissions. The opposition to the grant of permission by BAN is not about depriving hard-working families of their well-earned summer holidays, as has been suggested in some of the appellant's questioning. Uncontroverted evidence before the inquiry demonstrates that the vast majority of flights are taken by a small minority. More than half the population does not fly each year. Pre-pandemic estimates consistently showed around 70% of all flights are taken by only 15% of the UK population. The poorest do not fly and are least able to mitigate or move. Focusing on Bristol Airport, pre-pandemic statistics show that the majority of passengers using the airport earn more than £28,000 a year, and the large majority of flights are taken by individuals travelling alone or with only one other. Rather, the inquiry has to confront the fact that airport expansion to the benefit of this small minority will result in disproportionate impacts on the ability of the United Kingdom as a whole to meet our climate change obligations. The national and international consequences of jeopardizing these climate change targets is uncontroversial and will often fall most severely on those who have never flown at all. Exacerbating the climate crisis has profound economic, social, and environmental costs to us and to future generations. It can be difficult to conceptualize in planning terms how to address long-term impacts like climate change, but the NPPF helps in this regard, with paragraph 7 reminding us that the purpose of the planning system is to contribute to the achievement of sustainable development, and that this objective can be summarized as meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. The latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report is unequivocal. As attested by the climate scientists and as described by every major newspaper in this country, it is a code red for humanity. Global warming of 1.5 degrees C and 2 degrees C will be exceeded during the 21st century unless deep reductions in CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions occur in the coming decades. Irreversible climate change and its impact on the frequency of extreme weather events, the loss of coastline, flooding, and food security is the paradigm example of an outcome which compromises the ability of future generations to meet their needs. The contribution of the development proposal to climate change through additional CO2 emissions released into the atmosphere is an obvious material consideration in this appeal. There is a direct and unchallenged causal relationship between the additional emissions produced by the appeal proposal and the worsening of climate change. This proposal would shift the burden and need for mitigation caused from this generation to future generations. It is not contested by any party in this inquiry that climate change is worsened by increased emissions of greenhouse gases, nor that the appeal proposal will increase greenhouse gas emissions from the amount that there would have been if the development did not proceed. The fact that both these statements are uncontroversial does not and should not diminish their significance in planning decision-making. On the contrary, it should serve to emphasize how central the climate change impact of the proposed development is to the decision in this appeal. So, sir, I'll begin by addressing compliance with the development plan. And BAN's submission is that Bristol Airport Limited cannot demonstrate satisfactory resolution of the environmental issues associated with the appeal proposal because of its impact on the UK's ability to meet its climate change obligations. And you'll be well aware that policy CS23 of the development plan provides that proposals for development of Bristol Airport will be required to demonstrate the satisfactory resolution of environmental issues, including the impact of growth on surrounding communities and surface access infrastructure. Aviation 2050 strategy also provides, at paragraph 3.96, that the government proposes to require planning applications for capacity growth to provide a full assessment of emissions, drawing on all feasible cost-effective measures to limit their climate impact, and demonstrating that their project will not have a material impact on the government's ability to meet its climate change reduction targets. The onus is therefore placed squarely on the appellant by policy CS23 accurately to identify the extent of its environmental impact in the appeal, including on climate change, and then satisfactorily to address that impact. This is a burden that BAL simply cannot meet, and there are several reasons for this. BAL cannot demonstrate that their proposal will not have a material impact on the government's ability to meet its climate change targets. The magnitude of CO2 emissions caused by the appeal proposal is significant at both national and local level. The government's ability to meet its climate change reduction targets is already impaired by reference to the fourth and fifth carbon budgets. And the cumulative impact of the expansion of Bristol Airport in light of other airport expansions has not adequately been considered. Secondly, BAL cannot demonstrate that the development of sustainable aviation fuels and efficiency gains will mitigate its impact of carbon emissions of the proposal, and it cannot demonstrate that offsetting schemes such as EU ETS or Corsia will sufficiently mitigate the impact of the carbon emissions either. And finally, it has not adequately addressed the environmental impact of non-CO2 emissions of the proposal, nor the additional impact of releasing greenhouse gas emissions at altitude, and I will address each of these in turn. Turning first to significance, the national and local significance of the magnitude of CO2 emissions. You will be well aware that the IEMA guidance for assessing greenhouse gas emissions in environmental impact assessments provides that science-based targets informed by a maximum increase in global temperature in 2 to 2 degrees C from pre-industrial levels provides a good indicator of significance and could be used in EIA to calculate a project's carbon budget. This budget can then be compared against an existing carbon budget, global, national, sectoral, regional, or local, as available, to identify the percentage impact that the project will contribute to climate change. This approach is before this inquiry. It's reflected in the Tyndall Centre budget report used by Professor Anderson to conclude that the share of Bristol Airport's aviation emissions attributable to North Somerset Council would consume the entire carbon budget for the local authority in the 5 years between the start of 2028 and the end of 2032. Further, the additional emissions caused by the proposed expansion alone consume 82% of the 5-year carbon budget period, 2038 to 2042, for North Somerset Council by 2040. In cross-examination, Dr. Osmond Ireland took no issue with the methodology adopted by Professor Anderson and accepted that based on the IEMA guidance, it was one relevant approach which could be applied. No recourse to local budgets in order to determine the relative significance of the development proposal was taken in the EIA. And the reason for this is plainly because on any local carbon budget measure, the environmental impact of the proposed development is profound. It overwhelms the local carbon budget. And just stepping away from the written text to remind you, inspectors, that that was the case with Professor Anderson having calibrated those local budgets to take into account and neutralize any potential disproportionate impact on one local authority by having an airport in its area and not in other areas. So this is a local budget which is calibrated properly in order for this assessment to make sense. Back to paragraph 16. The significance of the CO2 emissions associated with the appeal proposal is further demonstrated by reference to the Climate Change Committee's balanced net zero pathway targets for aviation emissions. While it is of course the case that the Climate Change Committee's net zero pathway is not government policy, the IEMA guidance specifically refers to the CCC as a source of information for establishing future baseline emissions. And Dr. Osend-Ireland confirmed in cross-examination that he considered that a robust approach to assessing environmental impact of the appeal proposal would be to assess the carbon emissions in light of the CCC's pathways. When considered in relation to the CCC's balanced net zero pathway, BAL's with expansion case would lead to Bristol Airport underachieving against the reductions required by that pathway for aviation by a factor of 6. Even without expansion, there is an underachievement in relation to the CCC's target by almost a factor of 2 by Bristol Airport. However, the substantial worsening of the position caused by the expansion demonstrates the significance of the emissions associated with the proposed development. As Professor Anderson said in his evidence, it is akin to pouring yet more fuel on an already out-of-control fire. Dr. Osend-Ireland noted in cross-examination that while reference had been made to the CCC pathways, a comparison between the level of emissions expected by the CCC in future years and the level emitted by the development proposal had not been carried out by BAL. Accordingly, by reference to multiple different methodologies endorsed by the IEMA guidance, the magnitude of CO2 emissions associated with the proposed development is significant. BAL has placed great emphasis on the fact that the airport expansion represents a tiny percentage of the headroom planning assumption for UK aviation as a whole, or similarly, that 2 million passengers per annum is only a small fraction of the 25% increase in passengers between 2018 and 2050 assumed in the CCC's balanced net zero pathway. However, any single development is always going to represent only a small fraction of national sectoral emissions. Even if every emitter were permitted to rely on this argument, the significance of cumulative effects of carbon emissions would be entirely erased from planning decision-making. Furthermore, no planning decision-maker would seek to minimize the significance of an economic benefit of a development on the basis that it represented a tiny fraction of UK GDP, or that the number of jobs created is a tiny fraction of the total UK number of jobs. It is similarly nonsensical to insist that this approach be taken to carbon budgets. That approach was characterized by Professor Anderson as mathematically illiterate. Further, the 25% increase in passenger growth by 2050 compared with 2018 levels, modeled in the balanced net zero pathway, assumes that unlike the baseline scenario, this growth occurs only without any net increase in UK airport capacity, such that any expansion is balanced by reductions in capacity elsewhere in the UK. And BAL has not identified any other airport elsewhere in the UK at which it is expected that capacity will correspondingly be reduced in light of the expansion of Bristol Airport. On the contrary, there are plans in place for the expansion of Heathrow and Gatwick, as well as regional airports Luton, Stansted, Leeds Bradford, and Southampton. Further, the assessment of significance must require consideration of absolute levels of greenhouse gas emissions caused by the appeal proposal, in addition to any relative assessment. As Professor Anderson said, every ton of carbon emitted into the atmosphere matters. Paragraph 152 of the NPPF makes clear, it makes reference to absolute reductions, requiring that the planning system should, taking it shortly, shape places in ways that contribute to radical reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. The ES and ESA produced demonstrate that the proposed development would cause a net addition to the UK's carbon emissions rather than any reduction. So turning then from that analysis of significance and extent to the question of whether the expansion of Bristol Airport will have a material impact on the government's ability to meet net zero in 2050 and the sixth carbon budget. BAL's argument that the impact of carbon emissions are not material because of the legal obligations on the Secretary of State to achieve net zero by 2050 and the availability of future policy mechanisms is circuitous. If BAL were correct, it must follow logically that any level of carbon dioxide emissions, no matter how great, could never affect the government's ability to meet its climate change obligations, because ultimately it is the Secretary of State's responsibility to find a way to attain net zero by 2050, and he or she can take advantage of policy mechanisms in the future to make carbon emission savings elsewhere. Such an approach transparently disregards the reality that the likelihood of attaining net zero by 2050 is directly influenced by local planning decision-making, such as the decision made by North Somerset's Planning Committee to reject this application, and the decision now before you, the inspectors. The greater the emissions which are permitted, the fewer options remain open to the Secretary of State if the outcome mandated by Section 1 of the Climate Change Act 2008 is to be achieved. The greater the gross emissions of a development proposal, the more extreme the measures to be taken elsewhere, reducing emissions at other airports or across the economy. BAL has further emphasised that the balanced net zero pathway produced by the CCC does not constitute government policy and merely represents just one of the many potential pathways to achieve the outcome of net zero in 2050. However, as Mr. Melling accepted, the legislated sixth carbon budget was set, i.e. the quantum of CO2 emissions reductions required was determined by reference to the CCC's balanced net zero pathway. The CCC observes in the report that the balanced net zero pathway provides the basis for our recommended level for the carbon budget. Accordingly, it is entirely appropriate for you, the inspectors, to have regard to the balanced net zero pathway when deciding whether the appeal proposal will have a material impact on the government's ability to meet the sixth carbon budget. BAN's case, as you are aware, is that it does have such an impact. We are already operating in a context where the viable options remaining open to the Secretary of State to achieve the sixth carbon budget and net zero by 2050 are rapidly diminishing, given that the United Kingdom is, as Mr. Melling agreed, not on track to meet either the fourth or the fifth carbon budgets. Professor Anderson has confirmed that the UK is currently well off track to meet both those budgets. Further, the CCC, relying on 2018 and 2019 projections from the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, highlighted shortfalls in respect of the fourth and fifth carbon budgets in its 2020 progress report to Parliament. Given the obvious causal connection between meeting the fourth and fifth carbon budgets to the future achievement of the legislated sixth carbon budget, it is also clear that the Secretary of State has far from a theoretically infinite suite of policy options at his disposal to achieve climate change targets. Turning then to the absence of consideration of the cumulative impact of airport expansion and subsequent impact on the UK's ability to meet its obligations. In their June 2021 progress report to Parliament, the Climate Change Committee confirmed that their advice from the sixth carbon budget report remains unchanged, that there should be no net expansion of UK airport capacity unless the sector is on track to outperform its net emissions trajectory. There is no evidence before this inquiry that the UK aviation sector is on track positively to outperform its net emissions trajectory. While the CCC's advice does not compromise government policy, that does not diminish its obvious materiality as a planning consideration, a fact reinforced by the PPG on climate change. The CCC is an independent specialist statutory body, and as Mr. Hunter-Jones said in uncontroverted evidence, its observations represent the most authoritative and robust evidence of the climate change impact of airport capacity expansion on the UK's ability to meet its climate change targets. The impact of the development proposal by reference to airport capacity across the UK will determine if a development proposal represents net expansion of the UK's airport capacity. But Dr. Osmond Ireland accepted in cross-examination that in order to determine whether the appeal proposal will have a material impact on this ability of the government, it will be necessary to have regard to the cumulative context of UK emissions as a whole through to 2050, and there is no such assessment before the inquiry. That, of itself, is a flaw capable of legal challenge. Dr. Osmond Ireland further accepted that in the absence of any such assessment, it cannot be demonstrated that the development proposal will not have a material impact on the UK's ability to meet its climate change obligations. Accordingly, BAL's own climate change witness accepted that BAL could not meet the policy test set out in Aviation 2050 strategy. Mr. Melling, in his proof of evidence, concludes that the emissions from the appeal proposals will not be significant, in part because Bristol Airport's increase in emissions is well below that approved in Stansted. That is not, in fact, a point in BAL's favour. The fact that airport expansion has been approved at Stansted places an even greater strain on the limited space remaining in the carbon budget for aviation emissions. Properly analysed, the grant of planning permission for expansion of Stansted and the concomitant inevitable additional emissions increases rather than decreases the significance of additional emissions from the expansion of Bristol Airport. Turning then to the failure to demonstrate that environmental harms caused by increased greenhouse gas emissions can be mitigated efficiently, either by savings or by the use of sustainable aviation fuels. It is clear from the draft CCCAP that in relation to reducing what BAL terms Scope 3 emissions, which include the CO2 emissions caused by aircraft movements, comprising the vast majority of the emissions associated with Bristol Airport, a core part of its strategy rests on the proliferation of sustainable aviation fuels and other technological innovations. Further, the environmental statement assumes that achieving net zero requires sustainable fuel use. That is an unsound assumption. BAL cannot rely on the future widespread proliferation of alternative jet fuels, such as biofuel and synfuel, in order to mitigate the increased greenhouse gas emissions associated with this appeal proposal. Even on the most optimistic view proclaimed by the industry themselves, alternative fuels can be scaled up to cover only a fraction of the existing aviation fuel consumption by 2035 to 2040. The largely unchallenged evidence of Mr. Asher puts the matter beyond dispute. In particular, Dr. Osmond Ireland, the progenitor of the CCCAP, accepted that he was not able to take issue with the problems concerning biofuels and synfuels identified by Mr. Asher, as he was not sufficiently aware of them, and that he had not taken them into account. These unaccounted for matters include, first, the widespread use of aviation biofuels would have a negative effect on climate change, given the change in land use required for their scaled-up production, their relatively high cost compared with petroleum-based jet fuel, meaning that the aviation industry has consistently failed to reach its ambitions for their adoption. Second, synthetic fuel technology remains in its infancy and requires large quantities of renewable energy for its synthesis. Third, hydrogen flight is unproven and uncertain, with many technical and safety aspects not yet understood, making its commercialization and the development of completely novel fuel infrastructure for UK airports before 2050 extremely unlikely. And fourth, despite historical efficiency improving the level of CO2 emissions per passenger mile, the total emissions produced by aviation have been rapidly increasing because of the additional flights being taken over time. And you'll remember the evidence that Mr. Asher gave about the rate of aircraft efficiency improvement slowing over time, with only marginal gains now being achieved. So step changes in efficiency will not be possible unless there is significant new aircraft and engine architectures which are developed, which will take many years and decades to become significant parts of the flight matrix. In light of this, the prospect of mitigating the carbon emissions of the development proposals through the use of SAF, alternative flight routing, or efficiency gains should not be given any weight. The profound uncertainty still surrounding the deployment of technologies such as SAF and additional efficiency gains should further affect the weight given attributed to the scenarios set out in the Jet Zero consultation. The evidence and analysis document makes it clear that the scenarios are not prescriptive and emphasizes the uncertainty that are surrounding those scenarios. The scenarios outlined in the consultation presume a step up in ambition on SAF, efficiency improvements, and introduction of zero-emission aircraft. And they are all necessarily aspirational rather than indicative. Even on the least ambitious of these scenarios, the use of biomass would need to be prioritized in aviation over other sectors. The rate of fuel efficiency assumed would not be met if airlines failed to modernize their fleets at sufficient speeds or invest in the necessary aircraft advancements, a failure made more likely by the financial impact of COVID-19 on the aviation industry and technological advances in battery and hydrogen technology by 2030. So the Jet Zero scenarios cannot be understood as an expression of the likelihood that SAF uptake and efficiency improvements will materialize quickly enough to ensure the decarbonization of the aviation sector before 2050, and certainly not one on which any reliance can be placed for the purposes of planning decision-making. Of course, the Jet Zero consultation does not yet represent government policy and is highly likely to change following the receipt of consultation responses from stakeholders. In light of all of this, no weight can safely be given to Jet Zero. Moving on then to the failure to demonstrate that environmental harms caused by increased greenhouse gas emissions can be mitigated via offsetting through UK ETS or Corsia. So the cap on emissions imposed by UK ETS, as it is currently legislated, will cease in 2030. Accordingly, as was accepted by Dr. Osmond Ireland in cross-examination, the UK ETS as it stands will not run to the 6th carbon budget period, nor the full period or to the attainment of net zero by 2050. And similarly, Corsia is due to end in 2035. Further, as the law currently stands, the UK ETS applies only to flights going to and from the UK EEA in Gibraltar, and so accordingly the scheme will not apply to all of the flights arriving at and departing from Bristol Airport. The inadequacy of Corsia against the UK's net zero target is reiterated by the CCC's 6th carbon budget report, which states that the Corsia scheme is not currently compatible with the Paris Agreement or its UK path. The current level of ambition under Corsia is an insufficient contribution to the goals of the Paris Agreement, and for now, the CCC's recommendation on credits within the Corsia scheme is, as for other credits, that they should not be used in meeting the UK's carbon budgets. So BAL cannot rely on the impact of either the UK ETS or Corsia as adequate mitigation measures of the significant environmental impact of its proposed development. Nor can BAL properly ask you, the inspectors, optimistically to speculate about the future development of UK ETS and Corsia schemes. It has been oft repeated throughout this inquiry that you are required to apply the law and policies as they are at the time of your decision, and not as one party hopes that they might become. As the law currently stands, there is nothing upon which you can rely to suggest that either or both offsetting schemes will adequately reduce aviation emissions. Accordingly, little weight can be given to UK ETS and none to Corsia in determining the extent to which it is possible for BAL to demonstrate that it can mitigate the environmental impact of the proposed development. And it is plain that BAL is relying on both UK ETS and Corsia when assessing the environmental impact of the development, as the environmental impact assessment makes it clear, and I set out there the quote. The assumptions in the environmental impact assessment are, on the clear evidence before this inquiry, demonstrably unsound. Finally, it is not lawfully open to BAL to suggest that you must, pursuant to paragraph 188 of the MPPF, assume that the UK ETS or Corsia will operate effectively. The reasons for this, based on a detailed analysis of the relevant case law, are set out in BAN's legal submissions, and I will not repeat them, unless, of course, you'd like me to give a short summary. Sorry, unless you'd like me to give a short summary of those legal submissions. Yes, please. Okay. So in short, the legal submissions are that the case law under paragraph 188 of the NPPF over many years demonstrates three things. Firstly, that the assumption in paragraph 188 of the NPPF is just that, an assumption, not a presumption. Secondly, that where there is evidence that shows that that presumption is not safe or should not be made, then it must not be made. And third, that the way in which the presumption operates on the evidence is how that should be taken by you, the inspectors, at the inquiry. So tying that all together with the evidence that's before you, there's clear evidence that UK ETS and Corsia will not operate as BAL has suggested in order to address the impact of aviation emissions, either from its development or indeed generally. And with that evidence in mind, the assumption in paragraph 188 cannot be applied. What must be understood in this inquiry is that the UK ETS and Corsia do not offer the solution. Also, I address in the legal submissions that there's a difference in kind between the UK ETS, which was the focus of the submissions, and the normal approach that's taken when one is looking at paragraph 188 of the NPPF and making the assumption in relation to pollution control regimes. The usual pollution control regimes are looking at environmental permits, which will often operate to address particular emissions from particular developments. And plainly, that's not the way that the UK ETS operates. So it's different in kind, and in any event, the assumption simply does not apply on the evidence. Back then to the written text, and the failure to assess the harm caused by non-CO2 emissions in the environmental impact statement. The Climate Change Committee specifically recognizes that aviation produces a range of non-CO2 pollutants that affect the climate in different ways, and that overall, the net aviation non-CO2 effect is to warm the climate. Globally, non-CO2 effects contribute around 2/3 of the total aviation effective radiative forcing, twice as much as historical CO2 emissions from aviation. While the extent of non-CO2 effects remains uncertain and difficult to quantify precisely, there is no scientific doubt that they have a net warming effect on the climate. Accordingly, the CCC recommends that when considering how to limit emissions from aviation, it is important to recognize that non-CO2 effects are significant and that constraining the total distance flown each year has a greater relative benefit to the climate than measures which reduce the carbon intensity of flying. So while there remains uncertainty on the non-CO2 effects of aviation and further research is necessary, current best estimates show that aviation has a significant warming effect on top of that from its CO2 emissions. So action to limit those non-CO2 effects will be necessary, although obviously not at the expense of reducing CO2 emissions, which are longer lasting in their impact on the climate. BEIS has, in its 2019 methodology paper for the government greenhouse gas conversion factors for company reporting, after acknowledging the current uncertainty in this area, noted that the application of a multiplier to take account of non-CO2 effects is a possible way of illustratively accounting for the full climate impact of aviation, and it recommends a multiplier of 1.9 as its central estimate. No assessment of the extent of non-CO2 emissions associated with the development proposal has been undertaken as part of the environmental impact assessment of this appeal proposal. Dr. Osmond Ireland acknowledged in cross-examination that although the BEIS estimated multiplier for non-CO2 emissions was available and could have been referred to at the time of preparing the impact assessment, the multiplier had not been used. BAL's ES thus fails to apply the precautionary principle, which provides that likely impacts which would cause harm if they materialize should not be ignored simply because there is some dispute as to how they should be measured. A properly precautionary approach would have provided the best approximation of total climate impact, for example, by applying the multiplier rather than neglecting their impact completely. Dr. Osmond Ireland acknowledges in his proof of evidence that non-CO2 emissions cannot be ignored, but in fact, that is what has largely happened in BAL's evidence. Dr. Osmond Island simply states that BAL acknowledges in its CCCAP that there are non-CO2 impacts, and that he considers that that is the most appropriate approach to address the issue. The CCCAP itself gives only cursory attention to the non-CO2 effects of aviation, suggesting that the airport will continue to monitor government policy in this respect and reflect best practice in updated CCCAPs as part of the 5-year review cycle. And where possible, BAL will take action, an active role in reducing in influencing airlines to consider non-CO2 impacts of their operation. Further, the non-CO2 emissions were not taken into account by Mr. Melling as a specific material consideration affecting his conclusion on climate change in the overall planning balance. He simply reiterates the non-CO2 impacts of aviation are now appropriately addressed at national level and would need to be kept under review. With respect, that is simply not sufficient. Merely monitoring development in government policy concerning non-CO2 emissions and only where possible influencing airlines to consider their non-CO2 emissions falls far short of the requirement to estimate and to mitigate the impact of non-CO2 emissions for the purposes of preparing an environmental statement. The uncertainty associated with precisely quantifying non-CO2 impacts is no reason not to estimate their extent at all, certainly in light of the Bayes multiplier and the precautionary principle. It's plain that the warming effect of non-CO2 emissions has the potential to engage the UK's climate change obligations, which, as BAN has evidenced, are inextricably linked to the temperature obligations under the Paris Agreement. Accordingly, the environmental impact of non-CO2 emissions associated with the appeal proposal is relevant to the extent to which it materially affects the UK's ability to meet its climate change obligations. So I therefore move on to beyond the horizon, making best use, and that that policy does not contain a policy mandate for unconditional airport expansion. BAN's case on the MBU and the APF is that together they remain the most up-to-date policy concerning the government's approach to airport capacity expansion. However, the correct interpretation of these policies prior to consideration of their weight in the overall balance is that they contain no unconditional mandate for airport expansion. Rather, generalized government support for making best use or better use of runways is expressly subject to all relevant considerations, particularly economic and environmental impacts and proposed mitigations. Therefore, in order to determine whether the application of MBU and APF policies supports or counts against a proposed development, i.e. the side of the planning balance to which they lend weight, it is necessary to consider the prior question of whether the general support for making best use of runways is reduced or removed because of the environmental impacts of the specific application. If so, MBU and APF will weigh in the planning balance against the grant of planning permission. If, however, the environmental impacts of making best use of the runway are acceptable, then they will lend support to the grant of planning permission in the overall balance. The evidence before this inquiry as to the significant greenhouse gas impacts of the proposal and its contribution to climate change, and in light of the UK's projected failure to meet its 4th, 5th and 6th carbon budgets, is a countervailing environmental impact sufficient to overcome the generalised high-level government support for making best use of runways. Accordingly, MBU and APF, correctly implied in this inquiry, weigh against the grant of planning permission. It is no part of BAN's case that MBU and APF are no longer government policy in light of subsequent developments in the Secretary of State's climate obligations, such as the net zero obligation or the 6th carbon budget. Quite the opposite. Developments such as those that have taken place on climate are anticipated by MBU, which was, as Mr. Hunter-Jones said in evidence, obviously cognizant of the fact that circumstances change over the life of the policy. It is indeed apparent from the face of MBU that it is forward-looking regarding the possibility of environmental developments which postdate its inception. It says that there remains uncertainty over future climate change policy and international arrangements to reduce CO2 and other greenhouse gases. As Mr. Hunter-Jones emphasized, the key policy paragraph of MBU, paragraph 1.29, explicitly does not prejudge local decision-making, and instead requires that careful account be taken of all relevant considerations, including environmental impacts. This must include the UK's climate change obligations, including those which postdate the original implementation of the policy, such as the introduction of the net zero target and the inclusion of aviation in the 6th carbon budget. This is reinforced by the reference in footnote 39 of the Jet Zero consultation to MBU and the requirement for airport expansion to meet the government's climate change obligations in order to be able to proceed. BAL's position on MBU is, frankly, confused. BAL's written case and evidence suggest that MBU and APF are to be interpreted as invariably lending in principle support to the grant of planning permission for airport expansion. And that section on implications for the UK's carbon commitments in MBU means that the issue is essentially answered. In answer to the contention that carbon emissions of the proposal need to be considered in decisions on airport expansion, both Mr. Melling and Dr. Osmond Ireland's evidence repeatedly state, citing 1.11 of MBU, that the carbon impact of the development are matters which should be considered at national level. However, when Mr. Hunter-Jones said that he understood BAL's case on MBU was that carbon emissions should be disregarded by you, the inspectors, or that it takes them off the table or treats them as not significant, in response, Mr. Humphrey said that he was not aware that BAL had ever said that or relied on MBU to suggest that carbon should be disregarded. And so I asked Mr. Melling about this, and he confirmed that BAL's case is that nothing in MBU means that carbon emissions impact should be disregarded. Mr. Melling further clarified that the reference in his rebuttal at paragraph 3.5.4, where it appeared that consideration of some environmental impacts at national level was an answer to other parties' evidence on taking carbon emissions into account in this decision, should not be understood in that way. And that must, of course, be the correct way to understand MBU. As Mr. Hunter-Jones explained in his examination in chief, the structure of MBU makes this obvious. The policy statement begins at paragraph 1.25 under the heading Policy Statement. And the key policy is the emboldened paragraph 1.29, which I've addressed already. The discussion of national and local policy in the earlier sections of MBU is the context for MBU's conclusion that decisions on regional airport expansion can be delegated to local planning authorities. So accordingly, it's not actually in dispute in this inquiry that the greenhouse gas impact of the proposal is a matter for you, the inspectors, to consider, or that MBU does not provide, do put in the not in that sentence, which I appear to have left out, or that MBU does not provide the answer to that question, or requires you, the inspectors, to leave the matter to national government. MBU is explicit that environmental impacts and their proposed mitigations, including climate change and the UK's binding obligations to reduce emissions, are part of what local decision makers must take into account when interpreting the policy. Accordingly, it is entirely congruent with national aviation policy for you to understand the implementation of the 6th carbon budget and the UK's net zero commitment by 2050, and the fact that the UK is not on track to reach the 4th and 5th carbon budgets as compelling and important considerations that mean that the government's support for making best use of airport runways does not assist this proposal, given its environmental impacts. The MBU also does not advocate making maximum best use of airport runways outside of Heathrow at all costs. Rather, planning decision makers must take careful account of the environmental impacts and viability of proposed mitigation. BAL's shift in approach, while welcoming clarifying the correct position, does not change the fact that Mr. Melling's written evidence was that MBU remains extant, and the introduction of the net zero target in 2019 has not changed this position, nor will the inclusion of emissions from international aviation and shipping in the 6th carbon budget. How these emissions are managed is a matter for government to determine through its national aviation policy, and there are a range of legal and policy mechanisms available to ensure that its target and budgets are achieved. This incorrect interpretation of the effect of MBU formed the basis for Mr. Melling's assessment of the climate change impact in the overall planning balance of the development proposal, meaning that that analysis is fundamentally flawed. Finally, BAO's position in relation to the Stansted appeal decision is also contradictory. The decision is relied on extensively in both Dr. Osland-Ireland and Mr. Melling's proofs. However, the Stansted appeal decision takes the approach now disavowed by BAO. It states that MBU has thoroughly tested the potential implications of the policy making best use in climate terms, and it relies on MBU as determining that the climate impacts of expansion will be acceptable. On BAO's case now put forward, the approach that the inspectors should take, that the inspectors took in the Stansted decision should not be followed by you, the inspectors, in this decision. And so, just stepping away, the news which emerged overnight that there will not be any continuation of the legal challenge to the Stansted appeal decision really takes BAO's case nowhere, neither forwards nor backwards. The clear point is that the Stansted appeal decision is not consonant with BAO's position and is a position that has been stepped away from. So bringing all these together, and under the auspices of compliance with the development plan and material considerations, it is clear that the appeal proposal fails to accord with the development plan because BAO cannot demonstrate satisfactory resolution of the impact associated with the increased greenhouse gas emissions, both CO2 and non-CO2, caused by the appeal proposal. The proposed expansion will have a material impact on the UK's ability to meet the 6th carbon budget and the net zero target in 2050 and its obligations under the Paris Agreement. The magnitude of the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the appeal proposal is significant by reference to the IEMA guidance to consider local carbon budgets and the CCC's recommendation that there be no net expansion of UK airport capacity. Proposed mitigation measures relied on by BAO, such as the development of SAF and increased efficiency savings, and the potential future impact of the UK ETS and Corsia are wholly insufficient. As Professor Kevin Anderson said, the physics does not respond to rhetoric, only to action. Given the lack of compliance with the development plan, planning permission should be refused unless material considerations indicate otherwise. But they do not. National aviation policy, as articulated in MBU and the APF, compel planning decision makers to take careful account of all relevant considerations, including the environmental impact of airport expansion, rather than excluding consideration of the climate change impact of the appeal proposal. And it is made clear that the general policy of making best use of runways is expressly subject to the environmental considerations. So in light of the climate change impacts, the proposal does not in fact gain support from MBU. In light of the climate change impacts, the proposal does not shape places in ways that contribute to radical reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, contrary to paragraph 152 of the NPPF. And plainly, the climate impact of the proposal is such that it is not sustainable development and does compromise the ability of future generations to meet their needs. Finally, the Paris Agreement is an obvious material planning consideration, and it is addressed in BAN's legal submissions. And just stepping away in short, those legal submissions are that the temperature goals in the Paris Agreement, the goal to reduce global warming to below 2 degrees, well below 2 degrees, and approaching 1.5 degrees, that those temperature goals are obligations of outcome. So they essentially apply a legal obligation on the states parties to achieve a certain temperature outcome. And that there's not flexibility for states parties to adopt some other temperature goal that's not either well below 2 degrees or approaching 1.5 degrees. It's understood, returning to paragraph 75, that BAO will refer in that regard to the Supreme Court's decision in Friends of the Earth versus Heathrow. And will, as I understand it, submit that that decision is contrary to the analysis I've just put forward. But the Paris Agreement was relevant factual background to that decision. But the nature of the obligation on the contracting parties was not directly an issue before the Supreme Court. The Court does refer in paragraphs 76 to 78 to an attempted judicial review by Plan B Earth and others, but again that does not directly address the question of whether the Paris Agreement temperature goal imposes an obligation of outcome or not. So, to the extent that the Paris Agreement is a material consideration, it weighs against the proposed development. To the extent that BAL seeks to rely on the Jet Zero consultation as a material planning consideration, it is not planning policy, nor is it a consideration of any materiality. Instead, it concerns the commercial and research and development priorities for supporting the development of technological innovation in the aviation sector. In relation to the Jet Zero consultation, the evidence and analysis document makes it clear that the use of a modelling scenario is not a prediction for what the Department of Transport expects to happen regarding future capacity expansion. And Dr. Osmond Ireland conceded in cross-examination that his suggestion that the government's clear intention is to see passenger demand grow between 58 and 60% from a 2017 baseline, whatever pathway is adopted, went beyond what he should have done. Accordingly, there is no clear policy intention as to airport capacity expansion which can be derived from the use of modelling in the Jet Zero consultation. And turning to the last material consideration, the transport decarbonisation plan is also not a material consideration in support of the appeal for the unchallenged reasons given by Mr. Hunter-Jones. So to conclude, on the opening day of the inquiry and throughout its long weeks, it has been evident the extent to which this proposed expansion is opposed by local people. It is also remarkable the extent to which it is opposed by the elected representatives at all levels. Weston-super-Mare Town Council joined many others in passing a motion of objection as far back as November 2019. Bath and North East Somerset Council formally objected to the expansion plans in a motion in March 2019. And Bristol City Council passed a motion against the planned expansion on the 8th of December 2020. North Somerset's council's approach is clear, and BAN supports the council's submissions throughout the inquiry and given in its closing yesterday. At regional level, the West of England Combined Authority rightly described to the inquiry as the widest and most important local political grouping in the region, now firmly opposes expansion. And at national level, both the local MP, Dr. Liam Fox, and the neighbouring MP for Bath, Ms. Vera Hobhouse, oppose the expansion. In BAN's submission, that tells an incredibly important story. In a time of economic hardship, with post-COVID recovery high on the political agenda and uppermost in people's minds, the overwhelming majority of local people and their political representatives are not asking you, the inspectors, to approve the expansion. They are asking the opposite. Local people and their representatives see that they can and must find ways to meet their needs that do not exacerbate dangerous climate change and do not compromise the ability of future generations to meet their needs. Refusal of planning permission in line with the development plan, national policy, and other material considerations would properly recognise this. And BAN therefore invites you, the inspectors, to dismiss the appeal. So unless you have any further questions, those are BAN's closing submissions.
Just one point of clarification for me, if I may.
Yes, of course.
You mentioned that there was news overnight that the Stansted challenge isn't going further. Obviously, we know about Mrs. Justice Lang's decision some days ago, but
Yes.
is there some update on that that's in the public domain?
Yes, so I understand it, and I think it is in the public domain, given that it was given in open, that there was publicity made afterwards. My understanding is that the local authority, Uttlesford District Council, has chosen not to progress its appeal. And no doubt there will be a number of reasons put into the public domain for that. My understanding is that it is very significantly cost-related rather than any other reason, but it's not progressing.
Okay, that's useful. I'm sure that'll come out over the next few days, but I just wanted to keep up to date on it.
Yes,
Thank you very much.
absolutely so. And of course, the important point made is that that is fascinating, but that doesn't assist the appeal proposal.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Ms. DeHaan.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you.
Right, that concludes matters for today. Just looking forward to tomorrow, Mr. Humphreys. What time would you like to start?
So can I suggest that we have the slightly later start as we did with the council at 10 o'clock? I'll just explain, because of, like the council, the length of our submissions, what I'll call chapters, the sections of it, have been written as separate Word documents, and that's because very long documents frankly just become unstable, and so we've written it as parts. That means that in order to get paragraph and page numbering right, once we've finished it, we then have to manually go back in and restart the numbering at the beginning of each part, and then we will need to convert each part to a PDF and combine the PDF so that you have one document that looks like it's a whole. We will then need to print it. Now, my very strong ambition is to make sure that we have got those stages done, and certainly the PDF as one document, reasonably early today, sort of perhaps late afternoon, but that then means printing of a long document. I think it's preferable, if possible, that you and some others, if we can do it, have printed copies. If that's not possible, then maybe people will have to use the PDF. But the extra half hour may just help a little bit. So it's as prosaic, I'm afraid, and ordinary as that.
That's fine with us, isn't it? Yeah, well, we're happy with 10 o'clock.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we really would like printed copies, so if we can make every endeavour to...
I think it's helpful, with other people, and I'm really grateful to BANCC and Ms. DeHaan. I tend to sort of sideline things as you go along. I'm sure others do, and it's just easier if you can do it.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Right, okay, then the inquiry is now adjourned, and we'll resume again at 10 o'clock in the morning. Thank you, everybody.